Introduction. I don't get up to my father's grave nearly enough. He is buried about 10 miles northwest of Inverness, on a grassy hillside within the dry stone walls of an old cemetery. The grave marker is made of red polished stone, gold lettering all but gone. Only chiselled words remain. In loving memory of a dear husband and father, Thomas John McLean, who died at Oakfield on the 1st of November, 1970. His grave lies close to the cemetery wall, one of the last to be buried there before the town opened a new graveyard on its outskirts. The new cemetery isn't fortunate enough to have the same view over the sea. My father is luckier. And of course he is dead, but it is good to think that he has a nice spot. Those that come to visit, well, they care. We care. I didn't always care. My father's fatal heart attack happened a month short of my 11th birthday. I wasn't there for his funeral. It was agreed that children should not attend, and so my younger sister and I were kept away. Instead, we stayed with the McInnes family, just 100 yards up the road, and I was okay with that. I played darts with my best pal John McInnes in his bedroom, while Sister Shona was in the living room with Catherine McInnes playing something, I can't remember what. Mrs. McInnes looked after us while her husband went to the burial service. As far as I was concerned, the funeral happened in the background. Family and friends gathered from all over the country. Aye, not just Scotland, but from all over the UK, and some from overseas too, from Norway and Italy and even America. Funny, it never struck me as odd at the time. Eventually, Mum, other people called her Elizabeth or Liz, came to collect us. She was wearing a black hat, black woolen jacket, and black skirt that she kept just for funerals. She was at the door. I wasn't expecting her to be so black. "Right, children, let's go," said Mum. "Oh, Liz, will you not stay for a cup of tea? The kettle's on." Delly McInnes speaking as Shona sidled past her. Mum just managed a brief smile from the doorway, shook her head in regret, and took the hands of my sister and I as she led us back towards the car. Soon we were at the fresh earth of my father's grave, the grave digger replacing the final clods of grass on top. "Why are there no flowers?" asked Shona. "That was your father's wish. He didn't approve of flowers at men's funerals." Mum was looking across to the gravedigger, who was standing awkwardly in her line of sight. An old Highland tradition was that the gravedigger received a shilling for luck. This stemmed from a time in the 16th century when a strange illness spread throughout the population. Victims would fall into a deep coma, often appearing to be dead, but would then revive after 3 or 4 days and go on to make full recoveries. Families with money would pay the gravediggers to watch over their recently departed during the first night, just in case they were not dead and needed rescue. Sometimes a string would be attached from the finger of the corpse to a bell placed above the new grave. With a gasp of understanding, Mum rummaged in her black handbag to find the coin and gave it to the old man. He took it the way a chimney sweep might have shaken her hand at New Year. The value meant nothing to him. He just hoped it would bring us luck. But even as a 10, nearly 11-year-old boy, I knew that it was strange for a gravedigger to have tears in his eyes. As he broke away, he placed his large, calloused hand on my shoulder. "You're the man of the house now." His voice quivering, his grip changing to a pat as he went to go past. But then he stopped, about to say something else. He looked at me, kind eyes under ingrained lids, but with a sigh he thought better of it, picked up his shovel, and moved away. Little did I know then that this giant of a man was called Tom McPhee, and that before he died of old age some 20 years later, he would tell me a story about my father that broke my heart. "You'll soon be the man of the house," is what my father used to say to me. He would come home drunk, and as I helped him to bed, he would smile at me, stroke my cheek with the back of his fingers, tears in his eyes. "You'll soon be the man of the house, son. Look after your mother." I'm sure I wasn't 7 when I first heard him say that. In his final weeks, I could still make out that sentence among all the slurring noise that he would utter in his drunkenness. I didn't want my father to die. I wanted him to get better and be a real father like other boys' fathers. I wanted him to stop getting up at 10 a.m., heading out to the pub by 10:30 with eyes full of defeat, only coming home again when the last pub had shut its doors late in the night. I didn't want him to be found lying in the gutter, with vomit staining his tweed jacket. I didn't want strangers coming to the door, helping him home, because he couldn't stand up, looking at my mother as if to say, "Well, aren't you going to reward me?" I didn't want the other kids at school laughing at me and calling me names. I can still see them now. 1st of November 1970 was a Sunday. Our home was a large guest house, which at the time was closed for the winter. My mother inherited property when one of her uncles died. She used that to develop a bed and breakfast business, and within a couple of years had moved us all into a beautiful 19th century mansion, which she converted into a very successful family hotel. She ran the place single-handedly, managing over 20 staff. I can't remember a time when my father didn't drink as if there was no tomorrow. And as we didn't keep alcohol in the house, a deliberate ploy by my mother, he had to go out and pay for it, using the money my mother was working so hard to earn. That Sunday morning, we had breakfast around the kitchen table. Just my mother, sister, and me, an empty chair pointlessly waiting to be occupied by my father. As the pubs did not open on a Sunday until midday, we didn't expect to see Dad downstairs for a couple of hours yet. Rather than cook again, Mum put a plate of bacon, sausage, black pudding and eggs on a tray, together with a cup of tea on a saucer. "Ian, take this up to your dad. He'll need something in his stomach." I took the tray. No big thing, I'd been helping to serve in the dining room that summer, and made my way upstairs. My father had long since taken to sleeping in one of the other bedrooms. The drink made him snore, and my mother wanted nothing to do with him when he was drunk. As I opened the door of number 3 bedroom, I could see that my father was almost falling out of bed. He was lying on his side, his lower arm outstretched, nearly touching the floor, his head unsupported beyond the mattress, and yet he was still asleep. I rested the tray on the wide windowsill until I could empty it. I then pulled across a wooden chair to the side of the bed. The empty tray became a bridge on which I placed a pillow. With all the strength that was in me, I lifted Dad's head and shoulders so that he could be more comfortable. No matter how much I struggled moving him, he didn't wake. I crept back out of the room and quietly closed the door. Perhaps this was the day when he wouldn't go out. 3 hours later, Mum went to find out why he hadn't come down. He'd missed lunch, and the pubs had been open for over an hour. I heard her scream from the living room. On reaching the hallway, I found she was at the top of the stairs clutching the banister. "He's dead!" she was roaring, a voice she has only ever used once. Her horror like a dark blanket rushing down the stairs. Of course, Dad hadn't moved from the position I had innocently placed him in hours earlier. But as Dr. Anderson arrived to confirm the death, as Auntie Edna pulled up to hug Mum, as Mrs. Bissett made the tea, it was not horror I was feeling. It was relief. The story ahead is not about me, but it's important for you to understand where it came from. When my father died, it didn't make the 6 o'clock news. It barely made an inch in the deaths column of the local newspaper. While my mother seemed to care, the others in my circle seemed to reflect my feeling that an embarrassment had been removed. It's not easy being a kid at school when your father is a drunk. The teachers give up on you, and you're the butt of every joke going with your so-called classmates. I used to get into fights, but then I just stopped engaging. I became distant. Then he died, and everyone felt sorry for me. All these kids who would gang together to beat me up. Suddenly I was different. I didn't feel different initially, I just was. My father's death separated me from most of the rest, and they didn't know how to react. I didn't need to remain distant any longer. The bullies just stayed away from me. They soon found someone else to target. I continued at school, and teachers finally took an interest. Poor fatherless boy. My world seemed to change. I was indeed the man of the house now, and I needed to do what I could to make sure I gained a good career so that I could look after my mother in her old age. We think like that when we are 11, some of us. I didn't exactly forget about my father. His absence helped define our new family group. We had become a single-parent family. This was at a time when such constructs had become very rare. Divorce was unusual outside of metropolitan areas. And while the war had created lots of single-parent families, we were several generations further on. There was Duncan Grigger, whose sheep-farming father had a heart attack while out in the fields one night, and whose body wasn't found until the next morning. And then there was Susan Stewart. Her mother had been married, but then divorced and moved into the area, the biggest scandal of that year. We were only the third single-parent family that we knew. So this is how it was over the following 4 years. I got my head down, worked hard at school, did well in exams, and grew into a young man. With my father gone, the family coffers soon built up. We even went on holidays. Real holidays outside Scotland. At some point in my 15th year, I found myself in the loft of our home. There was always lots of treasure up there, and on this particular day, I came across a leather suitcase full of old photos that my mother must have put up there many years before, for safekeeping. Being naturally curious, I took the suitcase to my room and started to look through the pictures. Lots of people in black and white, or faded sepia. Photos of children where the edges had lost their detail, others of people probably long dead. There was Mum as a young girl on my grandfather's farm with her horses. My Uncle Willie as a cheeky wee boy, and then in his RAF uniform during the war. Other pictures were of Mum as a very beautiful young woman, sometimes with a tall man at dinner or dancing at a party, and sometimes with someone not so tall, but handsome, I supposed. This shorter man was also in pictures by himself, and then there were others of him in uniform, and one of him marching a Nazi prisoner through gates somewhere. The Nazi was clearly a Nazi. Since I was a boy of the 1960s and 70s, I had been bombarded with films and comics about the Second World War. That and sci-fi movies. I could spot a Nazi at 100 yards in a snowstorm, even if he was dressed in white and hiding behind a hill. I took the photo across to Mum, who was in the kitchen. "Mum, what's this all about? Why have we got it in a box of pictures about you?" Mum took the photo and sighed. She looked up at me. "That's your father." There were 3 men in the picture. A British Army officer, who was in several other pictures I had already looked at, the Nazi, and a tall, thin man in a uniform I did not recognize. It was clear that only the German was under arrest. "Which one?" I asked. "Him," said my mother, pointing to the British officer, and not a little irritated that I could possibly think it was the Nazi or the tall, thin other. I was utterly confused. What on earth was she telling me? Had there been someone else before Dad? I struggled to get the question out. "So, what happened to him? And when did you meet up with Dad?" She looked at me for a few moments before understanding, and then a wave of sympathy engulfed her. The irritation had gone, her voice softened. "That is your dad. Take a good look. He was very handsome in his day." I looked again at the grainy picture taken by a war photographer. I could see it was him now. The bloated face and stomach were gone. He was upright, confident. He had purpose. It was the eyes that led me in. All the other features, even his nose and chin, had been distorted by something. In that moment, I realized that I had no idea who my father was. How had this man changed from a clearly fit and healthy young army officer into the wreck that I remembered? And who was the Nazi? And who was the tall, thin man? And where was the picture taken? Mum simply said, "Sorry, dear, that was all before I met him. He never talked about any of that stuff with me. I didn't want to know, and he certainly didn't want to talk about it." And so there it was, a single picture, lying on the kitchen table. To me, it was the obelisk from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was a message that there was someone out there who I needed to find. Over the next 30 years, I spent roughly 1 week per year visiting people and countries where my father had lived and worked, and where people remembered him. Of course, I had no idea at the start that the journey would be so long, or that the story would be so vast. I started with my father's sister, Jean, who knew snippets of Dad's story and had met a couple of the people he had worked with during the war. Many of those I tracked down didn't want to be found. Some of those were initially hostile. But often, just the idea of a son wanting to connect with his dead father was enough to make them open up, even if it was only to give me one more name. Eventually, I ran out of time. People were already old when I was 15, and by the turn of the century, almost everyone who knew my father during the war years, and who I had been able to trace, was dead. So, what follows is Thomas John McLean's story. My father's story. As close to the truth as I can make it.